The airport buzzed with life, but for me, the world had gone eerily silent. I clutched my daughter's tiny hand, her chubby fingers wrapped tightly around mine. She was just 3, too young to understand why her mom had to leave, but old enough to sense something was wrong. "Mommy, where are we going?" she asked, her voice soft and trusting. I knelt to her level, my hands trembling as I tucked a stray curl behind her ear. How do you explain to a child that you're leaving because you have no choice? My heart felt like it was being torn apart, yet I forced a smile. "Sweetheart, Mommy has to go for a little while, but I'll come back, okay? I promise." Her big brown eyes stared into mine, searching for answers. "You promise?" "I promise," I whispered, though my voice cracked. I kissed her forehead one last time, inhaling the sweet scent of her hair. As I stood, my sister walked forward, her heels clicking against the cold, tiled floor. She reached for my daughter, her painted nails stark against the softness of my child's tiny hand. "I'll take care of her," my sister said, her voice brisk but carrying a hint of hesitation. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab my daughter and run. But instead, I nodded and watched as my little girl walked away, her small feet following someone else. "Mommy," she called, her voice echoing in the cavernous terminal. She reached out her hand, and I froze, tears streaming silently down my face. I should have turned back. I should have taken her with me. But my circumstances left me no choice. I watched her disappear into the crowd, my promise to return echoing in my mind. And then, she was gone. Years passed, but the memory of that day at the airport haunted me like a shadow I couldn't escape. My daughter's face, her eyes full of trust and her tiny hand reaching out for me, was etched into my mind. I had tried to bury the pain, convincing myself it was for her good, but every quiet moment reminded me of what I had left behind. When I finally returned to the city, it was nothing like I had imagined. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, but everything felt unfamiliar. My heart pounded as I stood in front of the house where my sister now lived. My sister, who had raised my daughter as her own. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. My hand trembled, my pulse racing like I was about to face a storm I wasn't ready for. The door opened, and there she was. My little girl, now 8 years old. But she wasn't little anymore. Her once chubby cheeks had thinned, her curls had grown longer, and her wide eyes now carried a spark of independence. My heart stopped as she looked up at me, her expression blank, unfamiliar. Before I could speak, a voice called out from inside, "Sweetheart, who's at the door?" A woman stepped into view. She was elegant, her smile warm but confident. My daughter turned and ran to her without hesitation. "Mommy," my daughter cried, wrapping her arms around the woman's waist. I froze. The word hit me like a slap. "Mommy." My knees nearly buckled, but I forced myself to stand tall, biting down on the scream rising in my throat. I wanted to tell her, "No, sweetheart, I'm your mom." Me, but the words stuck, buried beneath the weight of guilt and regret. "Oh, hello," the woman said, her tone polite but slightly guarded. "Can I help you?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. All I could do was stare at the woman who now held my daughter as if she was her own. My daughter looked up at her, her eyes sparkling with a joy I hadn't seen in years, and a lump formed in my throat. I just moved back to the city," I finally managed to say. "I used to live here, and I thought I'd drop by." Her eyes flickered with recognition, but she said nothing. "Mommy, who's she?" my daughter asked innocently, tugging at the woman's sleeve. I flinched at the question. Who was I now? I'm just someone your mommy used to know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to hug her, to hold her, to tell her how much I had missed her. But she didn't remember me. She didn't even know who I was. "Would you like to come in?" the woman asked, her voice polite but uneasy. I shook my head. I couldn't bear to step inside and see more of the life I had missed, the moments I had lost. "No, thank you," I said quickly. "I just wanted to say hello." My daughter waved at me, her smile bright and carefree. "Bye, lady," and then the door closed. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the wooden door that now separated me from my child. My hands balled into fists, my nails digging into my palms. She had called someone else Mommy. But in that moment, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to let this be the end of our story. My daughter might not know me now, but I wasn't going to give up. The days after that encounter felt like a blur. I couldn't stop replaying the moment she had called someone else mommy. It wasn't jealousy. I knew the woman had stepped into the role I left behind. It was guilt, shame, and a deep ache in my chest I couldn't ignore. I rented a small apartment not far from my sister's house. From my window, I could see the park where children played after school. I started walking there every evening, hoping to catch a glimpse of my daughter. I wasn't ready to face her again, but I couldn't stay away. And there she was. She was sitting on a bench, holding a stuffed bunny in one hand while swinging her legs. The woman, her new mommy, sat beside her, scrolling through her phone. I sat on a nearby bench, careful to stay out of sight. My daughter's laugh floated through the air, bright and innocent, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed. But then I noticed something. A hesitation in her laugh, a flicker of sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. It was subtle, but I knew my daughter. That sadness had to mean something. The next day I returned to the park, this time with a plan. I brought a sketchbook and some colored pencils, sitting in the same spot as before. I wasn't going to approach her directly. Instead, I hoped to quietly become part of her world. "Excuse me," a small voice said, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked up, my heart leaping into my throat. It was her. My daughter. "Can I borrow a red pencil?" she asked, pointing to my set of pencils. I nodded quickly, my hands trembling as I handed it to her. "Of course, here." She sat down beside me on the bench, holding her stuffed bunny tightly. "What are you drawing?" I smiled, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just some flowers. Do you like to draw?" She nodded, her curls bouncing with the movement. "I draw bunnies. This is Mr. Fluffy." She held up the stuffed toy proudly. "He's adorable," I said softly. "You must be really good at drawing bunnies." Her face lit up at the compliment, and for a moment it felt like she knew me, like she remembered the bedtime stories I used to tell her about bunny adventures. But then she frowned. "Mommy doesn't like me drawing too much," she said, her voice dropping. My chest tightened. "Why not?" "She says I should do homework instead," she mumbled, hugging Mr. Fluffy. I bit my lip, fighting the urge to say something more. I wanted to tell her it was okay to draw, that she could be anything she wanted, but I couldn't overstep. "Not yet." "Do you come here often?" I asked gently. She nodded again. "Every Saturday. Mommy lets me play after my piano class." Her mention of the other woman as Mommy stung, but I kept smiling. "Maybe I'll see you again next Saturday, then." She grinned, her front teeth slightly crooked, just like when she was a baby. "Okay." And with that, she hopped off the bench and ran back to the woman. I watched her go, my heart heavy but hopeful. It was a small step, but it was a step. She didn't remember me yet, but I could feel it in my bones. She would. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the sadness I'd seen in her eyes. There was something she wasn't saying, something I needed to understand, and I would. I didn't care how long it took. I was going to rebuild what we had, piece by piece. The following Saturday, I returned to the park, this time with a plan to bring a bit of the past back to life. I carried with me a bag of art supplies, snacks, and something I hadn't seen in years, a photo album of my daughter as a baby. I spotted her right away, sitting cross-legged on the grass, sketching in the dirt with a stick. She glanced up and saw me, her face lighting up with recognition. "Hi, lady," she called out, waving the stick like a wand. I chuckled and approached her slowly. "Hi again, you look like you're having fun." She grinned, her curls messy and wild. "I'm drawing a bunny family." "Bunny families are the best," I said, sitting down beside her. "But I brought you something even better than a stick." I opened my bag and pulled out a set of colored markers and a blank sketch pad. Her eyes widened, her little hands reaching for them eagerly. "Are these for me?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Only if you promise to draw something amazing," I said, handing them over. She beamed, flipping open the sketch pad and immediately starting to draw. Her focus was intense, her tongue sticking out slightly as she worked on her masterpiece. "What's your bunny family like?" I asked, leaning closer. She held up her drawing proudly. "This is Mommy Bunny, Daddy Bunny, and Baby Bunny. They live in a carrot house." My throat tightened at the sight. She was talking about the life she knew now, a life I wasn't a part of. But I swallowed my emotions and smiled. "It's beautiful," I said. "Do you think Baby Bunny has a favorite bedtime story?" Her eyes lit up. Mommy Bunny tells him about a magical forest where bunnies go on adventures. My heart skipped a beat. She didn't remember it, but I used to tell her those exact stories when she was little. Maybe one day you can write your own story about Baby Bunny, I suggested. She nodded enthusiastically. I will. For the next hour, we sat together, drawing and laughing. I didn't push or say too much. I just let her be herself. She showed me her world through her pictures, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was beginning to understand her again. But the moment didn't last forever. The other woman, her mommy, approached us, her smile polite but guarded. Sweetheart, it's time to go, she said, extending a hand to my daughter. My daughter hesitated, looking at me with a conflicted expression. Can I come back tomorrow? She asked me softly. I glanced up at the woman, who raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Of course, I said gently. I'll bring more markers if you want. Promise? Promise, I said, my voice cracking slightly. She ran off, clutching her drawing pad to her chest. The other woman lingered for a moment, her gaze sharp. Thank you for being kind to her, she said curtly, but please don't confuse her. She's had enough upheaval in her life. Her words stung, but I understood the protective edge in her voice. I just want her to be happy, I said simply. The woman didn't respond, but her expression softened just slightly before she walked away. As I watched them go, I knew this wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope. My daughter was beginning to let me in, and I wasn't going to give up. The next week, I returned to the park as promised. I brought more supplies for my daughter, paints, stickers, and glitter glue, things I knew she'd love. But this time, I was prepared for something else. I had decided it was time to speak with the woman who had become my daughter's mommy. When I arrived, my daughter was already waiting for me on the same bench, swinging her legs excitedly. She waved at me the moment she saw me. Lady, look what I brought, she shouted, holding up a lopsided paper crown she'd made. I laughed, sitting down beside her. That's beautiful. Are you a queen now? No, I'm a princess, she declared proudly. Mommy says I should act like one too. The word mommy hit me like a slap, but I forced myself to smile. Well, every princess needs her own art supplies. I handed her the bag, and her face lit up with joy. But before we could get started, a shadow fell over us. She's enjoying herself, said the woman, standing just a few feet away. Her tone was polite, but there was an edge to her words. Hi, I said, standing and brushing off my hands. I was hoping to speak with you. She crossed her arms, glancing at my daughter, who was now happily distracted by the glitter glue. About what? About her, I said softly, nodding toward my daughter. Her posture stiffened. I think it's pretty clear that she's happy with the life she has now. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. I can see that you've taken care of her, and I'm grateful for that, but I'm still her mother. Her eyes narrowed slightly. A mother who left her behind? The words cut deep, but I refused to back down. You don't know the whole story. Maybe I don't, she admitted, lowering her voice. But I do know that she needed someone, and I stepped in when you didn't. I swallowed hard. She was right, in a way. I had left, but she didn't understand the circumstances, the things I had sacrificed, the battles I had fought just to come back. I'm not here to take her away from you, I said finally. I just want a chance to be part of her life again. Her eyes softened slightly, but her guard didn't drop. Do you think you can just waltz back in and everything will be fine? She's a child. You can't confuse her like this. I know it won't be easy, I admitted, but she's my daughter. I love her. I've always loved her. For a moment, there was silence. We both looked at the little girl, who was now entirely engrossed in decorating her paper crown. She doesn't even know who you are, the woman said quietly, and if she gets hurt because of this, I won't forgive you. I understand, I replied, meeting her gaze. But I'm not going anywhere. I'll prove to both of you that I'm not here to hurt her. She sighed, shaking her head. You're stubborn, aren't you? I smiled faintly. You have no idea. She didn't respond but turned to walk away, leaving me with my daughter. The confrontation hadn't gone as badly as I had feared, but it hadn't gone well either. I still had a long way to go. When I looked back at my daughter, she was holding up the paper crown, beaming. Look, it's sparkly now, she said, her eyes shining with pride. It's perfect, I said, sitting beside her again. and for the first time, I felt like I had taken a real step forward. The woman might not trust me yet, but my daughter was starting to. That was enough for now. Weeks passed, and I kept showing up at the park every Saturday. Slowly but surely, my daughter began to open up to me. We'd draw together, talk about our favorite shows, and even share snacks. She started to trust me, and with every smile, I felt a piece of my heart heal. But it wasn't until one rainy afternoon that everything changed. That day, the sky was gray, and most people had stayed indoors. I wasn't sure if she'd even come, but I went to the park anyway. As I sat on the bench with an umbrella over my head, I saw her running toward me, her curls bouncing and her raincoat flapping behind her. I smiled and waved. "You're here. I didn't think you'd come in the rain." She plopped down beside me, her cheeks flushed and her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. "Mommy said it was okay, but I had to wear my raincoat." I nodded, hiding the sting of the word mommy once again. "Well, I'm glad you came. Rainy days can be fun too." She grinned, kicking her legs. "Can we play?" "Of course," I said, pulling out a small packet of crayons and waterproof paper I'd brought just in case. We sat there for a while, drawing bunnies and flowers under the shelter of the umbrella. The rain fell harder, and soon the park was almost empty except for us. That's when it happened. She put down her crayon and turned to me, her expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" My heart skipped a beat. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her raincoat. "Why do you always come here?" The question caught me off guard. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Because I like spending time with you," I said gently. She tilted her head, studying me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "You remind me of someone," she said softly. My chest tightened. "Who do I remind you of?" Her brow furrowed as she thought. "I don't know, but I think I knew you before." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them away. "Maybe you did," I whispered. She looked at me for a long moment, her small face thoughtful. Then, out of nowhere, she scooted closer and leaned her head against my arm. "I like you," she said simply. I froze, the warmth of her words spreading through me like sunlight breaking through the clouds. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged in her world again. "I like you too," I said, my voice trembling. For the rest of the afternoon she stayed close to me, asking questions about my favorite colors, foods, and stories. It was as if she was piecing together a connection she didn't fully understand. When her mommy came to pick her up, my daughter didn't run to her right away like she usually did. Instead, she turned back to me, her eyes wide and questioning. "Will you be here next week?" she asked. "Always," I said, my voice firm despite the lump in my throat. She nodded, then hesitated for a moment before throwing her arms around me in a quick, shy hug. As she ran off with the woman, I sat there in the rain, tears streaming down my face. They weren't tears of sadness this time. They were tears of hope. My daughter was beginning to remember me, not in words or details, but in her heart. And that was a breakthrough I hadn't dared to dream of. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had expected. My daughter's small gestures of affection grew bolder. Hugs when she arrived, laughter that came easier, and questions that made me feel like I was finally becoming part of her world again. But it wasn't just my daughter. Even the woman who had raised her, the one who had every reason to feel threatened by my presence, began to soften toward me. She wasn't unkind. She was protective, cautious, and, in her way, loving. One day, after my daughter had run off to play with some kids in the park, the woman sat down beside me on the bench. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just watched the little girl who had brought us together in such a complicated way. "She talks about you a lot now," the woman said finally, breaking the silence. I glanced at her, surprised. "She does?" She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "She calls you her park friend, but it's more than that. I can see it in the way she looks at you." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I never meant to take her from you," I said softly. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "I know, and I can see that you love her. But you have to understand, I've been her mother for years. I'm the one who's been there for her scraped knees, her nightmares, her first day of school. I can't just step aside." "I don't want you to," I said, my voice firm but calm. "You've given her so much, and I'll always be grateful for that. But I'm her mother too, and I just want her to know that." Her gaze softened, and she let out a small sigh. "You're stubborn, aren't you?" I smiled faintly. "You have no idea." For the first time, she smiled back. "Then I guess we'll just have to figure this out together." That conversation marked a turning point. The woman and I began to work together, putting my daughter's happiness above everything else. Slowly, she allowed me more time with my daughter. Weekends at the park turned into afternoons at my apartment, where we baked cookies, painted pictures, and read bedtime stories. One afternoon, as I tucked my daughter into bed after a long day, she looked up at me with those big brown eyes that had always felt like home. "Are you my other mommy?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but curious. My heart raced. I wanted to cry, but I held it together for her. "Yes," I said softly. "I'm your mommy too, and I've always loved you, even when I wasn't here." She stared at me for a moment, her little face thoughtful. Then she reached out and wrapped her arms around my neck. "I love you, Mommy," she whispered. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I held her close. This wasn't just a breakthrough. This was everything I had dreamed of and more. A year later, my daughter's life was filled with both of her mothers, two women who loved her fiercely in their own ways. On her 9th birthday, we celebrated together. Me, her other mommy, and the little girl who had brought us both together. She no longer called me her park friend. Now she called me Mom. And every time she said it, I knew I had finally come home. Months turned into years, and what once felt impossible had become our new reality. My daughter's world now included two mothers, each of us filling different but equally important roles in her life. The bond between the three of us, though unconventional, grew stronger as we focused on what mattered most: her happiness. There were still challenges, of course. Navigating birthdays, school events, and holidays took compromise and patience. There were moments of tension, moments when old wounds threatened to resurface. But every time, we reminded ourselves of the little girl at the center of it all, the one who deserved a life full of love, not conflict. One evening, as I was helping my daughter with her homework, she looked up at me with a mischievous smile. "Mommy," she said, tilting her head, "do you think I could get 2 Christmas presents? One from you and one from other Mommy?" I burst out laughing, shaking my head. "Nice try, sweetheart, but we're on to you." She giggled, her laughter filling the room like music. Moments like these were what I had fought for, what I had dreamed of. The turning point for all of us came on her 10th birthday. She wanted a big party, and for the first time, her other mother and I planned it together. We spent weeks preparing, picking out decorations, baking cupcakes, and organizing games. On the day of the party, the house was filled with her friends, their laughter echoing through the rooms. As I watched her blow out the candles on her cake, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. My daughter looked around the room, her eyes bright with joy. She wasn't just happy, she was thriving. "Did you make a wish?" I asked her quietly as the guests cheered. She nodded, leaning close to whisper in my ear. "I don't need to wish anymore. I have everything I want." My chest tightened and tears pricked my eyes. I hugged her tightly, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of her words. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the house had grown quiet, her other mother and I sat together, sipping tea in the living room. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "I didn't think this would work at first. I thought we'd end up fighting over her." I nodded, smiling faintly. "I didn't think you'd ever let me in." She chuckled softly. We both underestimated each other. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment before she added, "She's lucky to have you. You fought for her in a way I didn't think anyone would." I looked at her, my voice steady. "She's lucky to have both of us." She smiled, raising her cup in a silent toast. As my daughter grew older, our lives continued to evolve. I never stopped cherishing the moments I had with her, the small victories that reminded me of how far we had come. She would always be my little girl, the one who brought me back to life when I thought I had lost everything. And now, whenever she calls me Mom, it's not just a word, it's a promise. A promise that I will always be there, no matter what. Together, we had built something beautiful out of the pain and uncertainty. Together, we had found a way to move forward. And for the first time in years, I felt whole.